In 1970, Chevrolet built an engine so powerful that it scared the entire American automotive industry. The LS6 454 produced 450 horsepower straight from the factory. That's the official number. The real number? Well, we'll get to that. This is the story of the last great American big block and how its own success killed it. Along the way, we'll see muscle car wars, corporate panic, government crackdowns, and the end of an era that would never come back. So let's begin. But first, how did American engines get so ridiculously powerful in the first place? See, to understand the LS6, you need to understand the decade that created it. The 1960s in America were absolutely insane when it came to cars. Every manufacturer was locked in an arms race. More power, more cubic inches, bigger engines. It started with Pontiac in 1964 when they stuffed a 389 into a mid-size chassis and created the GTO, and from that moment on, every American automaker lost their collective minds. Ford responded with the 427, Chrysler brought out the Hemi, and Chevrolet, they kept pushing their big block family further and further, the 396, the 427, each one bigger and meaner than the last. But here's the thing. General Motors had an internal policy. No car under a certain weight could have an engine larger than 400 cubic inches. It was supposed to prevent things from getting out of control. It didn't work. The divisions found loopholes. Dealers installed bigger engines after the sale. Chevrolet themselves offered the 427 in the Corvette because it was classified as a sports car, not a muscle car. The whole system was a joke. And by 1970, GM finally gave up pretending. They lifted the displacement ban entirely. The gloves were off. This is where the 454 comes in. Chevrolet had actually developed the engine a year earlier, in 1969, but only offered it in the Corvette. Now it could go into anything, the Chevelle, the Monte Carlo, the El Camino, and Chevrolet didn't just make one version, they made several. The LS5 was the base 454, rated at 360 horsepower. Solid engine, plenty of power for most people. But most people weren't who Chevrolet was worried about. They were worried about the guys who wanted the fastest, most brutal machine on the street, the guys who would buy a Plymouth Hemi Cuda or a Ford Boss 429 if Chevrolet didn't have something to compete. And for those buyers, there was the LS6. Now, the LS6 wasn't just a 454 with a few tweaks. It was a completely different animal. Let me walk you through what made it special because, honestly, the engineering here is kind of insane. The block was the same Mark IV big block that Chevrolet had been developing since 1965. 4-bolt mains, strong as an anvil. But inside, everything was different. The LS6 got a forged steel crankshaft, forged steel connecting rods, forged aluminum pistons. The compression ratio was 11.25 to 1. That's incredibly high. You needed premium fuel just to keep it from detonating. The camshaft was aggressive. The intake valves were huge, 2.19 inches. The exhaust valves were 1.88. And sitting on top of all that was an aluminum intake manifold feeding a massive Holley 4-barrel carburetor. 800 cubic feet per minute of air and fuel flowing into this thing. The official rating was 450 horsepower at 5,600 RPM, 465 pound-feet of torque at 4,000. Those were the numbers Chevrolet printed in the brochure. But here's where it gets interesting. Those numbers were lies. I don't mean they were optimistic. I mean they were deliberately underreported. See, by 1970, insurance companies were paying very close attention to horsepower ratings. A teenager buying a 450 horsepower car paid astronomical premiums. It was becoming a real problem for sales, so manufacturers started rating their engines using methods that produced lower numbers. Gross horsepower measured at the flywheel, with no accessories, no air cleaner, no exhaust restrictions. When people actually dynoed the LS6 with proper equipment, they were seeing 500 horsepower, sometimes more. The engine was making significantly more power than advertised, which was exactly the point. You could tell your insurance company you had a 450, but you and everyone at the drag strip knew the truth. The LS6 only came in one car in 1970, the Chevelle SS. And getting one wasn't easy. You had to check a very specific box on the order form, option code Z15. It cost an additional $263.35 over the base LS5 engine. For that money, you got one of the most powerful production cars ever built by a mainstream American manufacturer. Think about that for a second. $263 for an extra 90 horsepower. In today's money, that's still less than $2,000 for an engine upgrade that would transform your car into a quarter-mile weapon. Car magazines went absolutely crazy. Motor Trend tested a 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6 with the Muncie M22 Rock Crusher 4-speed manual transmission, 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds, quarter mile in 13.44 seconds at 107 miles per hour. Those were supercar numbers. Those were numbers that would embarrass most sports cars today. And the thing is, those tests were run with the stock tires, which were terrible. The skinny bias ply rubber that came standard couldn't put the power down. Reviewers reported massive wheel spin in first and second gear. The engine was making so much torque that the tires just gave up. On better rubber, the times dropped even further. The LS6 Chevelle became an instant legend. It was the king of the muscle car era, the ultimate expression of American horsepower excess. But here's the thing about being king. Everyone's gunning for you. The competition was fierce. Plymouth had the 446-pack and the Hemi. Dodge had the same engines in different sheet metal. Ford was pushing the Boss 429 and the Cobra Jet. But in straight-line performance, the LS6 Chevelle was at the top. It was the benchmark everyone else was chasing. And Chevrolet knew what they had. The marketing wasn't subtle. Print ads showed the Chevelle SS as a barely contained beast. The messaging was clear. This car was dangerous, powerful, and unapologetic. It was everything the muscle car era represented. But even as the LS6 was dominating the streets and the drag strips, forces were gathering that would destroy it. And those forces had nothing to do with the competition. The first problem was insurance. I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth understanding just how bad it got. By 1970, insurance rates for young drivers buying high-performance cars had become genuinely prohibitive. We're talking about premiums that could exceed the cost of the car itself over a few years. Insurance companies had done the math. Young men plus extremely powerful cars equaled massive claims. So they adjusted their pricing accordingly. This killed sales. It didn't matter how good the LS6 was if your average buyer couldn't afford to insure it. The customer base was shrinking fast. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to 1970, because the second problem was even worse than insurance. The government was getting involved. The Clean Air Act of 1970 changed everything. The Environmental Protection Agency was established that same year, and suddenly there were real regulations about what cars could emit. High-compression engines running on leaded premium fuel were directly in the crosshairs. The emission standards being proposed would be impossible to meet with engines like the LS6. And it wasn't just emissions. Safety regulations were tightening. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had been established in 1966, and by 1970, they were looking very closely at the muscle car phenomenon. Fatality rates among young drivers of high-performance vehicles were genuinely alarming. Politicians were paying attention. The writing was on the wall. The third problem was fuel. The oil crisis was still a few years away, but gasoline prices were already climbing. More importantly, the quality of available fuel was declining. The lead additives that allowed high-compression engines to run without detonation were being phased out. An 11-to-1 compression ratio requires high-octane fuel. Without it, the engine destroys itself. Chevrolet saw all of this coming, and for 1971 they made changes. The LS6 returned, but it was different. The compression ratio dropped from 11.25 to 1 down to 9-to-1. That's a massive reduction. The official horsepower rating fell to 425. But wait, it gets more confusing. For 1971, the industry also switched from gross horsepower to net horsepower ratings. Suddenly, the numbers looked even lower, even though the engines hadn't changed as dramatically as the specs suggested. The 1971 LS6 was still a powerful engine. It was still the top option in the Chevelle SS lineup. But it wasn't the same. The compression drop alone cost significant power. The aggressive camshaft timing was softened. The whole character of the engine changed. And then, after 1971, the LS6 was gone. Just like that, 2 years of production, approximately 4,400 units in 1970, roughly 19,000 in 1971, though that number includes LS6 engines that went into Corvettes. The most powerful engine Chevrolet had ever put in a passenger car canceled because the world had changed around it. Now, the 454 itself didn't disappear. The LS5 continued through 1975, though its power ratings dropped every year. By 1975, the 454 was making 215 horsepower. That's less than half of what the LS6 produced in 1970. Same displacement, same basic architecture, but strangled by emissions equipment and low compression. The muscle car era didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whimper. Engine after engine was detuned, canceled, or replaced with something smaller and weaker. The Hemi was gone by 1971. The Boss 429 lasted only 2 years. The big block as a performance option essentially died in the mid-70s, replaced by anemic V8s that could barely move the increasingly heavy cars they were installed in. It's honestly a little depressing to think about. In 1970, you could walk into a Chevrolet dealer and order a car that would run high 12-second quarter miles with a warranty. By 1975, you couldn't buy anything even close. The entire high-performance market had collapsed. But here's where the story gets interesting again. Because the LS6, in its brief 2-year existence, had created something that couldn't be destroyed by regulations or insurance rates. It had created a legend. The people who bought LS6 Chevelle in 1970 and 1971 knew what they had. They held onto those cars, they maintained them, they passed them down. And as the years went on and the muscle car era receded into history, the LS6's reputation only grew. By the 1980s, the collector car market had discovered these machines. Prices started climbing. A documented LS6 Chevelle with matching numbers became a genuinely valuable thing. Not just sentimental value. Real money. Today, a properly documented 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6 with the original drivetrain can sell for $200,000 or more. Convertibles have gone for over $1 million at auction. The car that cost less than $5,000 new has become one of the most valuable American automobiles ever built. The irony is thick. The LS6 was killed because it was too powerful, too expensive to insure, too dirty for emerging emission standards. And now it's a 7-figure collectible precisely because of how rare and extreme it was. The very things that made it commercially unviable made it historically priceless. But there's another piece of this story worth telling. The LS6's influence didn't die when the engine was discontinued. It lived on in the enthusiast community. The hot rodders, the racers, the people who refused to accept that performance was over. Throughout the 70s and 80s, big block Chevrolets remained the foundation of American drag racing. The Mark IV architecture that the LS6 was built on proved endlessly modifiable. People bored them out to 496 cubic inches. They added superchargers. They ran nitrous. They pushed these engines to power levels that would have seemed insane in 1970. The LS6's specific combination of parts, the forged internals, the aggressive cam, the free-flowing heads, became a template. When someone wanted to build a serious big block, they started with LS6 specs and went from there. The engine lived on not as a production option, but as an ideal. This is what a big block should be. And in 2011, something remarkable happened. Chevrolet revived the LS6 designation, not for a big block, for a small block. The LS6 became a variant of the LS1 used in the C5 Corvette Z06, 385 horsepower from a 5.7-liter V8. It was a completely different engine, sharing only the name and the Chevrolet heritage. But the fact that they chose to resurrect that specific designation tells you something about its lasting power. The LS6 name meant something. It still does. Let's talk about the broader context for a moment. The LS6 454 wasn't just an engine, it was the peak of an entire philosophy. The American automakers of the 60s believed that displacement was the answer to everything. More cubic inches, more power. Bigger is better. That philosophy produced some incredible machines, but it was fundamentally unsustainable. The rest of the world was going a different direction. European and Japanese manufacturers were developing smaller, more efficient engines. They were investing in overhead cam technology, fuel injection, and sophisticated suspension designs. While American engineers were figuring out how to cram more air into bigger cylinders, everyone else was learning how to do more with less. This isn't to say the LS6 was stupid or backwards. It was brilliant at what it was designed to do. In a straight line, on a drag strip, with good fuel and no emissions equipment, it was one of the most effective engines ever built. But that's a very specific set of conditions, and those conditions were disappearing. The muscle car era was an anomaly. A brief window when American manufacturers prioritized straight-line speed above almost everything else. No airbags, marginal brakes, suspension designed more for comfort than handling. Emissions? What emissions? The cars were glorious and terrifying and absolutely of their moment. The LS6 was the last hurrah, the final statement before the world changed. After 1971, American performance would go underground for decades. It would survive in drag strips and hot rod shops and garage builds, but it wouldn't return to the showroom floor in any meaningful way until the 90s. And what of the people behind the LS6, the engineers who designed it? The big block Chevrolet was the product of many hands, but a few names stand out. Dick Keynath was the chief engineer of the Chevelle program during the LS6 years. Fred Frinke worked on the big block development. These were engineers who understood that they were building something special, even if they couldn't have known exactly how special it would become. Most of them continued working at General Motors through the malaise era. They watched the engines they'd created get strangled by regulations. They developed the catalytic converters and EGR systems that were necessary but killed performance. It must have been frustrating, but they also lived to see the resurrection. Many of them were still around when the LS1 small block brought real performance back to Chevrolet in the late 90s. The 454 itself had a long afterlife. Even after the LS6 was discontinued, it continued in trucks for decades. The big block found a home in heavy-duty applications where torque mattered more than emissions compliance. The last 454s rolled off the line in the early 2000s, still using the basic architecture that had been developed in 1965. That's nearly 40 years of production. Not bad for a dinosaur. There's something poetic about the LS6's brief existence. 2 years. That's all it got. 2 years to establish itself as the benchmark of American muscle car power. 2 years to terrify insurance companies and delight drag racers. 2 years to become a legend. Some things are better for being brief. If the LS6 had continued through the 70s, getting weaker every year like the LS5 did, its legacy might be different. Instead, it remained frozen at its peak, 450 official horsepower, 500 actual horsepower, the king that never declined because it simply ceased to exist while still on top. The muscle car era ended, but it didn't stay dead. Starting in the mid-2000s, American manufacturers began building seriously powerful cars again. The Dodge Challenger with its modern Hemi, the Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 with its supercharged small block, the Ford Mustang Shelby GT500. These cars produce power numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1970. 600 horsepower, 700. More. But they're different. They have sophisticated traction control and stability management. They have airbags and crumple zones and emissions equipment that actually works. They're faster than the LS6 Chevelle in every measurable way, but they're also safer and more refined. The raw, unfiltered brutality of the original muscle cars can't really be replicated in a modern regulatory environment. That's probably for the best. A lot of people died in those old cars. The combination of massive power, primitive brakes, and skinny tires was genuinely dangerous. The LS6 Chevelle could hit 100 miles per hour in the quarter mile, but stopping it from that speed was an adventure. The nostalgia tends to gloss over the sketchy parts. Still, there's something about the LS6 that modern cars can't quite capture. It's the purity, maybe, or the simplicity. An LS6 Chevelle has no computers, no fuel injection, no variable valve timing. It's just iron and aluminum and gasoline and noise. You turn the key, the carburetor opens, and 450 horsepower goes directly to the rear wheels without any electronic intervention. In an age where your car has more processing power than the Apollo spacecraft, there's something appealing about that directness. It's probably dangerous and definitely impractical, but it feels different in a way that's hard to articulate. The car is an extension of the driver in a way that modern vehicles, with all their safety systems and electronic aids, can never quite match. The LS6 454 was the last of its kind, the last truly unlimited American big block. After it came regulations and restrictions and the long, dark years of malaise. It represented the absolute peak of a philosophy that the world ultimately rejected. And that is the story of the LS6 454, the engine that was too powerful for its own good. It scared insurance companies, angered regulators, and terrified anyone foolish enough to mash the throttle without proper tires. It lasted 2 years and became immortal. Subscribe if you enjoyed this one, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen an LS6 Chevelle in person? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.